Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. This week we're reviewing 2001 A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick. Hopefully our video quality is a little bit better this week.
Probably.
I know it was a little rough last week. I apologize for that. But we're gonna hope that we learn from our mistakes, do better this week, and put out a better product.
Learning curve's a little hard for this, considering the fact that we've never done it even once before.
Not nearly as simple as audio podcast. I'll tell you that.
Especially not working with something as simple as Audacity. So
yeah, definitely. So anyway, like I said, we're here to review 2001. I think Stanley Kubrick's sci-fi masterpiece.
Yeah.
Maybe the sci-fi film, as we've referred it to.
That's what I would say. The sci-fi film.
Quickly, who was involved in the making of this movie?
I see. So this movie was directed by Stanley Kubrick, obviously. Screenplay is also by Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, who also wrote the novel. And stars, I'm probably going to butcher this a little bit, but Keir Dullea, if I'm saying that correctly.
That's probably close. Obviously, it's an MGM film.
Yep.
And it was made for somewhere between $10 and $12 million. And over its lifetime of releases and re-releases, it's accumulated around $146 million at the box office. Yep. I believe its initial run, if I'm not mistaken, it made around $30 million.
Not too shabby.
So, you know.
Originally released in the United States April of 1968. So.
That's right. The week before Planet of the Apes, if I'm not mistaken.
Really?
Which is interesting because Planet of the Apes that year won the Oscar for Best Effects. But I think the apes at the beginning of this movie look just as good, if not better, if you're asking me.
Maybe.
But no, so...
But April of 1968, this episode should be coming out around the exact same time as the release of this movie in the United States.
That's right. That's
kind of funny.
That's right.
Not planned.
I said the week after. I think it came out the week after. I don't know if I said the week after or the week before earlier.
The week after. You said the week after.
Okay. Well, anyway. So the week after. I just wanted to clarify.
Around the same time. That's all
around
that
the same time. Anyway, so this film is very visually interesting to watch.
It's definitely more a visual storytelling film than a dialogue-driven film. I think I've read multiple times, both times that I've watched it, somewhere that in the hour and 42-minute runtime, there's about 88 minutes that don't have dialogue whatsoever.
Yeah, there's a lot of this film that goes without dialogue and without any type of score. A lot of the space scenes, there's no sound.
Yeah.
Which is a very interesting choice for a movie, at the time especially. And I think it's got an odd structure. I mean...
It's more, most films, have their pretty generic three-act structure. This is more of a four-act
structure. And then you could divide that into sub-acts.
That middle act is definitely
the third act, what I'm calling the third act, which is the one, the part of the movie I think that everybody remembers and knows the best is the HAL 9000
story.
You could really probably divide that into three acts itself if you really wanted to.
I mean, because that whole section's almost an hour and a half by itself.
I think it's about an hour. It starts at, let's see, I wrote down it starts at about 55 minutes.
55.
And it ends at about the 2 hour mark. So
about
just an hour over an hour. So
it's a feature length movie almost in its own right.
And if any other filmmaker was making this film, I feel like that would be the movie. They would stretch it out by another 30 minutes or so, and that would be the movie. But this is Stanley Kubrick. He's very artsy. And so the first 20 minutes of this film is what he titled The Dawn of Man, as a Planet of the Apes movie, essentially.
I mean, it's before the time of man, just a bunch of apes and some aardvarks for some reason roaming around.
Yeah, I think aardvarks because they're very... not something that American audiences especially are used to seeing, so kind of that ancient feel, I guess.
Maybe. But actually, the first 3 or so minutes is kind of... I think you said it, kind of reminiscent of like an overture of a lot of older films. It's just a blank screen with music.
Yep.
And then we get into a lot of shots with just a bunch of scenery from like Africa and stuff like that. Apparently, all those are just matte paintings. None of them are actual real shots. They were all matte paintings.
That's really impressive if you think about it. But so we get into this first act, which is telling the prehistoric story of man, and we have these apes and people in costumes, obviously, which very good stunt actors.
Very good.
Very ape-like. Very.
The costumes themselves are very detailed. It's impressive.
Like I said, I think they're as good or better than anything that we saw.
Might be. I mean, they're a little bit different though. The apes in Planet of the Apes. I've not seen the original Planet of the Apes, but I've seen bits and pieces of it, not the whole thing all the way through. But they're meant to look more human-like in the Planet of the Apes. I mean, these are meant to look like primates. So
you're definitely right. In Planet of the Apes, they are, they're talking. They're supposed to be human-esque apes. Yeah. And this, they're definitely supposed to be like, the pre-evolutionary form of man. But
we kind of see this scene with them, and they're at this like watering hole basically, and this one group of apes is just sitting there, and they're essentially just drinking and water. living their lives, and this other group comes up, and we get the struggle of two separate factions of people.
And I want to compliment one of the things I like about Kubrick is he doesn't talk down to his audience.
Yeah.
He's very much about visual storytelling. And in this first act, you get what's going on without any cheap narration or
no dialogue whatsoever.
There's two rival tribes fighting over this water hole, and one of the tribes, the monolith appears to them, just
and they gain the knowledge of tools, and one of them finds a dead animal carcass and picks up its bones and uses it as a hammer and finds out, this can be used as a weapon. So
they use it to hunt down their prey
first.
And then as Kubrick's story, his symbolism here,
kind of as
soon as man learned how to use tools, he learned how to use it destructively.
Yep.
And he murders or defends his territory, however you want to view it, by killing the leader of the rival gang or whatever. So, and then he throws it up into the air, and we cut to this, what I'm going to call the second act of this film, which is...
Did it have a name?
I didn't see a title.
I didn't see a title card for it.
But basically, I just called it the moon sequence.
Yeah.
Which, it doesn't even start with the moon. It starts in a space shuttle going to this space station.
A Pan Am space shuttle, might we add.
Pan Am space shuttle. Goes to a space station. This second act is very heavy on effect shots.
Yes.
It's mostly just Kubrick and his team showing off what they can do.
And this scene, or this sequence, might have some of the most dialogue in the whole movie, too.
Yeah, definitely.
As well.
Once we get onto the space station and to the moon, a lot of talking, a lot of exposition that a lot of this movie lacks. But no, I'm really impressed with the effects in this second act. I mean, a lot of models.
For what we were able to accomplish in 1968,
yeah,
it's pretty impressive.
I mean, for approximately the same budget that Star Wars was made for about 9 years later, and the worst shot in this film looks about as good as I think the best shots in Star Wars look.
Yeah. I'd say, if you know, we obviously have another podcast that we review giant monster movies on, if you can see the Godzilla thing behind us.
It'd be hard to miss.
But we're sitting in the Heisei era during, the mid-'80s to mid-'90s, and these effect shots are light years ahead of what's going on in the mid-'80s to '90s and Toho in Japanese cinema.
Well, and I think a more apt comparison would be the Godzilla movies made in the 60s and the 70s, especially the 60s, because I think they had...
They're light years ahead of that even.
I mean, I think those were, like the golden era of those monster movies. And, there's this, invasion of astro monsters, a lot of it set in space. So I think it's an apt comparison. It was made in 65, I believe.
Somewhere around there. Don't quote him on that.
Don't quote me on that. I think it was made in 65. And it's light years ahead of that. Obviously, this had a much bigger budget.
Much bigger.
But I think another, if you want to compare it to American films, well, Star Trek was a TV show at the time, and again, obviously, much smaller budget, much shorter time frame to work on it. But light years ahead of anything the Star Trek television show was doing at the time. I'm trying to think of a movie that would have come out that would have been an apt comparison around the same time, but.
I mean, honestly, Star Wars is probably the most apt comparison for it. I mean, it came out almost 10 years later, but for around the same budget, and
and Star Wars looks good.
It's a sci-fi fantasy film.
Yeah.
Not like this, but the effects in that are still really good. But it came out 9 years later. 9 years later.
And and the effects, like I said, I think the effects in this movie are as good or better than anything we see in Star Wars. Now, of course, Star Wars had a lot of laser beam effects and all kinds of, probably more effects shot. Or as many effect shots, different kinds of effect shots.
I think I actually read exactly how many effect shot this has compared to Star Wars, if I can find it for you real quick. Alright, so this film contains a total of 205 special effect shots compared to Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, that came out in 1977's 350.
So, yeah, I mean, not as many as effect shots, but they obviously look very beautiful. But anyway.
This is a lot more... there's less, laser beams and stuff like that. Except, I mean, I guess technically the end of it, but this is
the light show. Different kind of
lot of model work and matting and paintings and stuff like that. So
projection, that kind of stuff, and it all looks really, really good. I mean, it's
all done to the highest quality.
Because Kubrick, obviously, he's a perfectionist.
Yeah, I also read somewhere that all the matte paintings that are used in this, Stanley calculated the amount of time it would take to create all the paintings. And he said it would take like some 13 odd years. So he hired 12 people and they did it in a year.
Yeah, and I mean the camera work itself is
gorgeous.
Amazing.
I mean the cinematography is incredible in this movie. I mean obviously Stanley Kubrick is a perfectionist when it comes to framing a shot as well. I mean, man loves symmetry, that's for sure. And it's very pleasing to the eye too to see very symmetrical shots. I mean, it's kind of people, especially people who have even slight OCD. Like you see something that's extremely symmetrical in a shot, and you're like, "Wow, that's gorgeous."
I mean, this movie, regardless of what I say about it at the end, is a visual masterpiece. No doubt about it. But anyway, so we get, and the second act kind of advances the story. They get to the moon. We learn that they've kind of spread, the Americans have spread a false rumor that there's a disease spreading around when actually they're just trying to keep people from landing because they've uncovered this monolith that they believe is from an ancient alien civilization, and it sends a message deep into space. And then we cut to the third act, which is called Jupiter.
Can you not read your own handwriting?
No, I can't.
I think it's just called like Jupiter Mission or something like
Jupiter Mission, yeah, that's what that is. I was like, man.
Yeah, I think it's just called Jupiter Mission. And we find out it's about 18 months after the previous events of the last act.
So the second act lasted from about the 20-minute mark to the 55-minute mark. So the 55-minute mark, we're into really the meat of this film.
Yeah.
A couple minutes later, we meet the main antagonist and the main protagonist of this film, almost an hour into the movie.
About 57 minutes,
David and HAL 9000. And so, yeah, very rare that you're going to have a movie where your main character shows up an hour into the movie.
Yeah.
But, of course, this is not a traditional film.
No.
So, but anyway, it is this David character. And, he and... this other
man, his name's Frank. If I'm not mistaken,
they've been sent to Jupiter to check this out. They don't know what they're going to look at.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure if Hal knows what's going on.
Not quite. He kind of makes comments as to maybe he might know what's going on.
Yeah.
Because he asks Dave and Frank if they are worried about certain aspects of the mission. What do they think is going on and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting. I mean, he is an AI, so...
Yeah. But...
AI.
Yeah, AI. So, yeah, this is the real core of this movie, and like I said, I mean...
Definitely the main story that most people would say this film focuses on.
Yeah, it's the thing that people remember the most famous part of the movie. Yeah. And obviously Hal, he's supposed to be incapable of error.
Yeah.
And the way I
essentially perfect, so...
The way I read this movie is that he makes an error, he projects that one of their EVA... units or whatever they call it is going to go down, but when they take it down they don't find anything wrong with it,
and then they send it off and the data comes back and another HAL 9000 has processed the data and determined that it doesn't have any problems.
So this essentially drives the computer insane. He can't handle the fact that he was wrong, so then he goes through extraordinary steps to try to cover it up, including killing the crew. And I think this sequence is actually, prior to this part of the movie, there really wasn't a plot. There was just a bunch of pretty scenery. But I think this is actually as a storytelling as a story, I think this third act is actually really intense, really good. I mean,
it's done really well.
This movie is slowly paced from the beginning to end.
I mean, if you call it pacing, I mean, there's really, I think you said there's really not a whole lot of pacing to it. I mean, it's just kind of
a series of gorgeous shots.
Yeah.
But no, I think this story is actually well written and well told.
Yeah, the main central story is definitely, I think it's written in a way that makes it intense and a lot of sequences. So
yeah, and so Hal goes crazy. He kills Frank when he goes out to replace the EVA unit again, and
kills the rest of the crew.
Kills the rest of the crew in a hibernation.
And then Dave goes after Frank and goes and captures him and comes back, and Hal won't let him in. There's a lot of good dialogue between a voice of a computer and Dave, where they're kind of arguing back and forth.
And some people may say that Dave, the actor, what would you say his name was? Keir Dullea. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. He, some people may say that he's kind of dry, he's kind of monotone, but I think that was intentional because he's supposed to be a trained astronaut. He's supposed to be able to handle, stay calm during
very
these,
stoic and
these.
Calm.
But I think he's able, if you really watch his performance, especially once Frank gets killed, I think he's able to portray the, he is the desperation under the facade that he's that he's putting on. I think he actually does that really well. And so I like his job. And then the performance of the actor doing the voice for Hal.
I think his name is Douglas Rain, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Douglas Rain.
He is, I mean, obviously his job is to be monotone.
Yeah.
But I still think his voice
comes across in a lot of sequences is kind of terrifying. I mean, it's tense. It's definitely, and then obviously combined with shots of this little oval like fisheye type thing with a red dot in the center of it. It's unsettling in certain scenes. I can definitely see how maybe in 1968 in certain sequences you could have looked at this and been slightly scared,
slightly unsettled. Yeah, I think he's able to portray that kind of pride.
Yeah.
You can hear that pride in his voice towards the beginning of this part of the movie, and then at the end when David is turning him off, I actually kind of feel sorry for Hal, because he's got kind of he's perfect, but he's also a child in some ways, and you can hear that desperation as he's begging for David to not shut down his memory.
And then they slowly take his voice down octave by octave by octave until it's essentially.
Then he starts singing this
non-vocal
creepy song. So I think all this is done really well. I really enjoy this part of the movie. And then we get to the last part.
The end of the movie.
Yeah, so...
Was it Jupiter and Beyond the Infinite or something like that?
Yeah, so Act 4 is called Jupiter and Beyond the Infinite. And it starts at about the hour 57 mark. And so it lasts for about, the last 30 minutes of the movie or so.
Yeah.
And I'd say,
at what point does the light show start? Because for the first few minutes of this act, it's more of... basically just the monolith floating through space.
About the first 5 minutes is the monolith floating through space. And then around the 2:02 mark, the light show begins.
The famous light show.
Which I don't even know how they pulled this. It's a combination of oils, I imagine, animation.
Oils and water.
Overexposed film and...
neon lights maybe filmed at certain angles against maybe mirrors or something like that would be cool.
For a 68 effect, it is done really well. I would love to know how they did it.
Maybe we could find that information, but
I don't know. I think I read something at one point that Kubrick largely kept that part, how he did that part secret.
That's cool.
But regardless, doesn't really. I mean, there's all kinds of interpretations you can make. It could be a metaphor for birth, for knowledge being absorbed by David, for
his journey through time.
I mean, it could be all kinds of things. But I mean, it's
the representation of the world's journey through time as man, stuff like that. So it's supposed to be ambiguous.
And it goes about 9 or 10 minutes. And then the last 15 minutes of the film or so is David. He
wakes up and he's in this very Victorian-esque looking bedroom.
Yeah.
And he wakes up and he's in his pod. And then we see him staring at himself as an older man in his suit or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then we cut, and then the pod's gone. And then he starts walking around. And then he sees himself as an older man sitting at a table. and then we cut, and then that guy's gone, and then he's sitting there, and he gets up and does some stuff, and then he sits back down, and then he gets up and looks over at himself as an even older man laying in bed, and then we cut back, and that guy's gone, and then he dies in bed.
He turns into a space fetus. So
I think what I've heard it called the Star Child, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
giant space baby. It's kind of scary looking.
Kind of creepy.
It has like an adult face on a baby.
And we see it's now giant, and it is
floating in space,
floating in orbit around Earth or towards Earth. And then of course the Sprague Zarathustra or whatever theme or whatever is swelling, and which, speaking of that, I had heard that actually they had a composer come in and do a score for this film, and this composer went to the premiere thinking he was going to hear his music, but at the last minute, Kubrick had pulled the score and added all this classical music, which I think I haven't heard the original score. You could track it down somewhere. I think it was the right choice. I think these pieces of music that Kubrick chose for this film,
they definitely fit
perfectly. Yeah. From the main thing the one that everybody knows and associates with this movie, the dun 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 dun, and the opera or the creepy choir thing they do with every time the monolith shows up. That's really effective, I think.
And there's a ballet suite that's featured heavily in the movie that is really good.
Bum, bum. Yeah. All that's really great. So I think that was a right choice by Kubrick. So, but yeah.
I mean, if I were that guy, I would have probably been a little upset.
I would have been upset, yeah. I mean, he had a chance to work on...
But at least he got paid. It's not like he made something he didn't get paid for it.
Yeah, he got paid for it. So, cry me a river. But I'm sorry. But no, so anyway... that's pretty much the plot of the film. What little plot there is. So yeah, I think, some people call this the greatest science fiction film ever made, but I guess we can get into some final thoughts and see if we agree with it or not.
Visually, absolutely, this is definitely the greatest visual sci-fi movie ever made. From a narrative standpoint, there's not a whole lot of plot structure to it, except for that third act where we actually have really a story. Because if we're being honest, the first two acts really don't have anything to do with that third act or that fourth act.
The second act
kind of leads into it a little bit.
Yeah.
But like that first act really doesn't have anything to do with it. But it really is just like about the journey of man. That's how a lot of people have described it. It's about the journey of man through space and time and their interaction with it. But visually, like I've said, it's a masterpiece. It's stunning to look at. And we watched the 4K edition that was put out a couple years ago, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, it looks amazing.
HDR on that is incredible. Really makes the colors pop. But I'm not here to talk about the transfer. Granted, it's great. But definitely, narratively is where this movie lacks. The pacing is definitely very slow, if you want to call it pacing.
Yeah.
And but I'd say definitely the best part of the movie is definitely that third act where we actually have some sort of narrative kick in, and it's definitely the dialogue is really good between these two men, and especially between Dave and Hal. I really like their dynamic, even though they're both kind of dry and monotone, with the visuals accompanied by the voices of especially like Hal. It creates some very tense sequences that I really enjoy watching. And then the fourth act is just a trip. If you are into that sort of thing, it's definitely a trip.
They say that if you, supposedly I read somewhere that if you if you took acid at the intermission, then it kicked in right about the time the light show started, which sounds pretty intentional to me. I don't know.
I don't know. It's definitely something visually stunning to watch. This movie is absolutely incredible. Is it the best movie ever made? No. Is it visually one of the best, if not the best movies ever made? Probably. It's definitely a high recommend for me. If you have any,
purchase or worthless.
It's definitely a purchase. Okay. If you got the money and the means and you have a 4K setup, I definitely would watch it on a 4K TV with a 4K player and the 4K copy of it. Definitely worth the purchase. Especially if you're a fan of sci-fi, or even if you're a fan of Kubrick, or if you just got nothing better to do, and it's a Saturday afternoon in March. why not? I mean, it's worth the watch for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna say obviously. I mean, purchase. Obviously, it's well worth the purchase of watching this film. I'm gonna say there is a caveat. I don't think this film is not for everyone.
No, definitely not.
If you are a more casual film viewer,
if you're the kind of person that likes to just go to the theater and watch your pretty standard blockbuster, definitely probably not for you.
Yeah, this movie is slow. I mean, there's not very much of a plot. It's just, like I said, a series of beautiful cinematic shots. Cinematography is amazing. Probably the best, some of the best, if not the best, you'll ever find in any movie ever. I do think the third act, what we're calling the third act at least, with Hal is actually a good, more traditional story of, this AI going crazy and killing off his crew. But I mean, I love Kubrick's visual storytelling style. I think even if it doesn't really flow as a movie, I love the first 20 minutes of these apes, learning to use tools. The second act, story, not very interesting, but just that's where they really take the time to show off the effects that they were able to create for this movie. Yeah. Very beautiful. And then, like I said, the third act, the stuff with Hal, as a story is actually pretty good. And then the light show at the end of the movie. And of course, the end of the movie gets really bonkers and really up for interpretation, and nobody really knows the answer. Probably not even Stanley Kubrick of what that was supposed to be about. But it's interesting to watch.
Yeah,
I don't
definitely.
think it's. At no point am I. This is a 2.5 hour epic, I guess. Yeah. And at no point during that 2.5 hours am I bored. No. I've seen this movie several times.
Especially with how slow it is. I would, for it being so long and as slow as it is, and kind of being just different sequences that maybe aren't cohesive, it's definitely not boring.
Yeah, definitely not boring. So, I mean, if you are a film lover, if you're a film buff, I think this is a required viewing. I would say, because it is an amazing film, an amazing piece of film history by one of the greatest film directors of all time. Maybe his definitive masterpiece. I know.
Some people argue this. Some people argue A Clockwork Orange. Some people argue The Shining.
The Shining. I think that's his big.
Some people even, I've heard, argue Eyes Wide Shut as his definitive masterpiece.
No. I think the three you listed off for that last one is
Spartacus is also supposed to be up there. I think Dr. Strangelove is supposed to be up there.
I think The Shining, this one, and Clockwork Orange are the three big ones. And I think for me,
Full Metal Jacket, can't forget that.
First half of it maybe. I think. If we're talking about those three, I think for me it comes down to The Shining and this.
Yep.
I'm
a horror lover, so I would probably pick The Shining over this. Yeah. But
I love horror movies, but I also love sci-fi.
Visually, this is a much better movie. I mean, I'm
not gonna say much better because The Shining is great, but I'm gonna say visually,
it's really impressive. There aren't a bunch of effect shots in that, so
yeah. But yeah, if you're looking for visually, this is the masterpiece. Storytelling wise, probably The Shining.
Yep.
If you forced me to pick one, I would probably say this just edges out The Shining. I'm talking about like a hair, and then my answer might change depending on the day and my mood. So.
See, I saw The Shining multiple times before I ever saw this movie, so that's partially why I'm partial to that. Yeah. So.
Well, anyway, I think that concludes our conversation on this movie. Next week, we will try to get a review of Close Encounters of the Third Kind out to you guys. Steven Spielberg's big 70s sci-fi masterpiece, I guess.
E.T.?
No. Well, that was 80s.
Yeah. But the 80s we're going to do Dune, so
80s
keep looking for that as
Dune. Well. 90s is Independence Day.
2000s is going to be Avatar, and then the 2010s is going to be Arrival.
That's right. So we hope you continue to follow us on this journey. If you enjoy this, we have two other podcasts. One, as we mentioned earlier, is Stomp This Way, where we review a different giant monster movie every week. If you have any kind of partiality to old cheesy giant monster movies, or new cheesy giant monster movies,
or some American giant monster movies.
Yeah, I don't.
So yeah, this next week we're doing Rebirth of Mothra. And then Godzilla vs. Destroyer, and then
we're gonna do Cloverfield.
Cloverfield, yeah.
The '98 Godzilla film. We're going to do...
a movie you said called Colossal.
A few weeks
that has Jason Sudeikis in it.
And Anne Hathaway as well, yep. So lots of exciting stuff over there. We also have our DNA
we also have
audio podcast.
Yeah, DNA Film Wars. Over there, we are doing a Christopher Nolan retrospective. We have 3 episodes up currently. Over Following, Memento, and Insomnia, and then the next episode will be over Batman Begins. Should be coming out relatively shortly. We're going to try to get that watched and recorded within the next couple days sometime.
Yep, and I think that's about all we have for you this week. So thanks for watching. As always, you can like and subscribe below, and we'll see you next time.